The 41st millennium does not understand silence. It understands the roar of bolters, the scream of chainswords, and the binary chanting of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It understands that for 10,000 years, humanity has survived by cataloging its nightmares. Magos Adept Kalen understood this better than most. Standing on the observation deck of the orbital defense station Imperator Wrath, high above the smog-choked atmosphere of Gehenna Prime, Kalen's mechadendrites twitched in sync with the station's cogitator banks. To Kalen, the universe was data. Orks were a numerical designation. Tyranids were color-coded biological warnings. Chaos was a corruption of code to be purged. Everything had a place, everything had a label until the augurs screamed. It happened in the gap between heartbeats. The Gehenna sector, a stable jewel of the Imperium producing 70 billion tons of promethium annually, was calm. Then the sensors registered a warp breach. Not the tearing, bleeding wound of a chaos incursion, but something surgically precise. Anomaly detected. Kalen vocalized his voice, a grinder of static. Time to emergence 0.3 seconds. There was no time for prayer. There was no time to light the sacred incense. The void tore open and sealed shut instantly, leaving behind a silhouette that offended the brutalist architecture of the Imperium. It was a vessel of terrifying elegance, where imperial ships were flying cathedrals of iron and gargoyles. This ship was a disk of sleek, predatory curves. It hung in the void, utterly terrifyingly silent. Kalen stared at the tactical hololith. The machine spirits within the station's logic engines were wailing, outputting error codes in languages the Mechanicus claimed machines should not speak. Classification Admiral Constantin Voigt barked from the command throne, his 3 decades of void warfare etched into his scarred face. Unknown Lord Admiral Kalen responded, feeling a chill in his remaining organic lung. No engine signature, no weapon heat buildup. It defies the catalog. Millions of kilometers away on the bridge of that silent vessel, the atmosphere was not one of panic, but of bored aristocracy. Lord Frieza sat upon his hoverpod, his tail swishing with the languid patience of a predator that had all the time in the universe. He sipped a glass of wine, his dark eyes surveying the tactical display of the primitive world spinning below. Zarbon Frieza said, his voice carrying a polite cadence that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. "What do we know about our new location?" The green-skinned warrior materialized beside him, bowing low. "My lord, navigation systems experienced catastrophic failure. We are no longer in charted space. However," Zarbon gestured to the image of Gehenna Prime, "this appears to be a human civilization. Extremely primitive by our standards, though they possess basic space travel and energy weapons." Frieza examined a perfectly manicured fingernail. How disappointing, he sighed. I was hoping for something more interesting after such a dramatic arrival. He looked at the planet again. 17 billion human souls huddled in hive cities. Infrastructure intact. Massive population centers. Frieza's tail tapped against his pod 3 times a tick. His inner circle knew meant he was calculating profit margins. Still, Frieza smiled. One must make do with what the universe provides. Before we begin proper business, I believe these primitives deserve a demonstration of their new reality. Back on the Imperator Wrath, the silence of the standoff was breaking. Klaxons wailed across the defense platform. Admiral Voight watched the alien vessel. It hadn't moved. It hadn't hailed them. It sat there 4 million kilometers out, mocking them. Target lock confirmed, the gunnery officer shouted. Lance batteries charged. Macro cannons ready. Fire, Voight began to say, but the order died in his throat. Contact Kalen screeched, his optical implants zooming to maximum magnification. Object launching from the alien vessel. Too small for a fighter. Thermal signature negligible. It wasn't a missile, it was a man. Kalen's logic processors stalled. The figure was humanoid white and purple, swimming through the vacuum of space as if it were a warm ocean. He moved with a casual pace, approaching the planet at velocities that made the targeting computers weep. Holy God, Emperor, someone whispered on the bridge. Frieza descended through the atmosphere of Gehenna Prime like a falling star that had decided to take a leisurely stroll. Below him lay Dominatus Primus, the planet's capital hive. 300 kilometers of towering spires, a monument to brutal efficiency, cramming 6 billion souls into a cage of plasteel and toxic fog. The air tasted of industrial runoff and despair. Frieza wrinkled his nose. It was distasteful but salvageable. He stopped hovering exactly 1 kilometer above the central spire. Power radiated from him in invisible waves, a pressure so intense that psychically sensitive individuals across the entire planet grabbed their heads, feeling a migraine made manifest. In the Imperial Palace, on the surface, astropaths began to scream. Greetings, Frieza's voice boomed. It didn't come from speakers. It came from everywhere. Through a method the Mechanicus would spend decades failing to reverse engineer, every voxcaster, every combead, and every audio output on the planet simultaneously broadcast his voice. I am Lord Frieza, the voice echoed smooth and terrifyingly calm. And as of this moment, this world and all its inhabitants are my property. High in orbit, Kalen watched the audio waveform spike on his console. This was impossible. This broke every law of the Omnissiah. I've recently found myself in unfamiliar territory. Frieza continued hovering casually in the smog, and I'm afraid I need to establish certain parameters for our future business relationship. Think of this as a demonstration of value, a proof of concept, if you will. Frieza raised one single finger. He pointed it at Dominatus Primus. Oh, and do try not to take this personally. Frieza added, his tone almost apologetic. It's nothing against you, specifically. I don't even know your names. This is simply how one announces their presence properly. At the tip of his finger, a sphere of energy formed. It was purple-red, the color of a bruised sun. It started the size of a marble, then a head, then a transport vehicle, then a building. On the Imperator Wrath, the augurs blinded themselves trying to read the energy output. Energy spike, Kalen yelled, his voice modulator cracking. It's off the scale. It exceeds planetary bombardment limits. Frieza flicked his finger. The sphere descended. It didn't burn the air, it pushed it aside. It touched the spire of Dominatus Primus. For a microsecond there was silence. Then the hive city ceased to exist. It wasn't a war, it was an erasure. The explosion was elegant in its totality. 6 billion lives ended in exactly 2.7 seconds, the precise time it took for the expanding sphere of annihilation to consume the city from the spires to the bedrock. The light turned the polluted sky into something tragically beautiful. Where a city of 6 billion had stood moments ago, There was now a perfectly circular crater, 17 kilometers deep, the edges glassed into obsidian. Frieza watched the genocide with the mild interest of someone checking stock prices on a slow Tuesday. "There," he said, his voice still broadcasting clearly over the screams of the dying planet. "Now that we understand each other, let's discuss terms." Kalen stared at the main view screen. His logic processors tried to categorize the threat. It wasn't an orc wah. It wasn't a tyrannid consumption. It was a business transaction written in blood. "I'm a businessman, you see," Frieza continued. "Your world will continue to function. Your people will continue their lives. All I require is acknowledgement of ownership and a modest taxation of resources." He smiled, a razor-thin expression that chilled the blood of an entire system. "Refuse, and I'll simply remove this world from existence entirely. You have one of your local days to decide. I'll be waiting." Frieza turned and began his leisurely swim back to the void, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any bombardment. The 41st millennium had just encountered something worse than war. It had encountered a hostile takeover. The silence that followed the destruction of Dominatus Primus was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of recalibration. On the bridge of the eternal supremacy, Frieza hovered back into the command center. He didn't look like a genocidal warlord. He looked like a CEO returning from a successful merger meeting. "Zarbon," Frieza said, settling into his pod with a sigh of contentment. "The local management seems pliable. Have we compiled the market research?" Zarbon, his green hair perfectly coiffed despite the dimensional transit, activated the main hololith. "We have, my lord. We've been intercepting their Vox transmissions. The data is primitive but revealing." Frieza sipped his wine. "Do tell. This civilization, the Imperium of Man, claims ownership of approximately 1 million worlds." Zarbon reported, scrolling through star charts that looked like they had been drawn by superstitious children. "However, their infrastructure is decaying. They rely on a form of dimensional travel called the warp, which is apparently inhabited by hostile entities they call demons." "Demons?" Frieza chuckled. "How quaint. They have ghost stories." "It gets better," my Lord Dodoria grunted from the weapons station. "Their leader is a corpse." Frieza paused mid-sip. "I beg your pardon." The God Emperor Zarbon explained, bringing up a grainy image of a skeletal figure on a golden throne. "He has been sitting on life support for 10,000 years. They sacrifice 1,000 psychics a day just to keep his batteries running, and they worship him." Frieza stared at the image. Then a low, cruel laughter bubbled up from his throat. "Oh, this is rich." Frieza wiped a tear from his eye. "An empire of 1,000,000 worlds ruled by a dead battery, and they call me a tyrant. At least when I rule, I have the decency to be alive." He swiveled his pod to face the view of Gehenna Prime. The smoking crater was still visible, a black eye on the planet's face. "Gentlemen, update to the business plan." Frieza announced, his voice sharpening into professional steel. "We aren't just conquering. We are acquiring distressed assets. This galaxy is desperate for competent management. We shall provide it." The comms console chirped. My Lord Zarbon smiled. "The planetary governor is hailing us." "Put him through. Let's seal the deal." The holographic face of Governor Hestus appeared. He was a man whose bloodline had ruled Gehenna Prime for 3 centuries. Now he was sweating through his silk robes. Lord Frieza," the governor stammered, "on behalf of the Gehenna system, we accept your terms." Wise Frieza said pleasantly. 50% of all Promethium output mining yields and industrial manufacturing transferred to my fleet on a weekly basis. In exchange, I don't turn the rest of your cities into parking lots. My lord the governor hesitated. The administratum tithe is already. If we give you 50%, the Imperium will. The Imperium isn't here. Frieza cut him off, his tone dropping an octave. I am. Would you prefer I negotiate for 75%? No, 50 is acceptable, perfectly acceptable. Excellent, Frieza smiled. Welcome to the Frieza Force. Do try to keep production up. I offer very aggressive performance reviews. High above aboard the Imperator Wrath, Magos Adept Kalen was watching the logic of the universe unravel. The station's augurs were screaming again, but this time they weren't detecting a single anomaly. They were detecting a hammer. Warp translation detected Kalen, intoned his voice devoid of the panic his organic brain was feeling. Massive scale, imperial signatures. Space tore open. Real space groaned as the prow of the Dominus Eternum, a Retribution-class battleship, dragged itself out of the warp. It was followed by 22 other capital ships and 47 escorts. Battlefleet Obscurus had arrived. It was a force that could crack continents, a cathedral of guns sent to punish the heretic. Kalen felt a surge of binary pride. The machine god had sent his angels of iron. This is Lord Admiral Caspian Voight to the Xenos intruder. A voice boomed across the open Vox channels. You stand accused of crimes against the Imperium of Man. Surrender is not an option. Punishment is mandatory. Kalen watched the tactical plot. The Imperial fleet arranged itself into a wall of battle, thousands of macro cannons turning to face the tiny, elegant disk of Frieza's ship. Target lock confirmed, Kalen whispered, linking his mind to the station's targeting cogitators to assist the fleet. Firing solution optimized. Probability of Xenos survival, 0.0%. On the alien ship, Frieza checked his reflection in the wine glass. Zarbon, he said, standing up and stretching his neck. The locals seem to have objections. I'll handle this personally. It's important to establish boundaries with new employees. He floated out of the airlock. No suit, no helmet, just purple skin and white armor against the infinite cold vacuum. Kalen's logic stack returned a fatal error. Biological entity detected in void. Survival impossible. Data corruption suspected. All ships, Admiral Voight's voice roared. Fire. The void turned white. 23 capital ships unleashed hell. Lance batteries, beams of coherent light that could boil oceans, struck Frieza directly. Macro cannon shells the size of apartment blocks slammed into him at relativistic speeds. Torpedoes detonated in a cascade of plasma fire that mimicked the birth of a star. For 90 seconds there was no space, only fire. Kalen monitored the energy output. It was enough to vaporize a moon. Target annihilated, he logged. Threat resolved. Praise the Om. The smoke cleared. Frieza was checking his fingernails. There wasn't a scratch on him. The white armor gleamed. He looked bored. Impossible, Kalen vocalized, his mechadendrites seizing up. Physics violation detected. Thermodynamics violation detected. Reality error. Frieza yawned, a gesture visible on the high magnification sensors. Then his voice cut through the static carried by that impossible transmission method. Is that all I've endured? Harsher treatment from a massage jet. Frieza raised a finger. He pointed it at the nearest escort frigate, the Righteous Fury. Bang, he whispered. A beam of purple light, thin as a needle, lanced across the void. It ignored the void shields. It ignored the meters of adamantium armor. It punched through the ship's reactor core and exited the rear engine block. The righteous fury didn't just explode, it shattered. One moment it was a warship. The next it was a cloud of expanding shrapnel and frozen atmosphere. Target destroyed, Kalen's cogitator reported flatly. Weapon yield incalculable. Frieza pointed again. Another beam. Another ship. The cruiser Sword of Faith split in half. The destroyer Vigilance vaporized. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, Frieza chanted, floating through the wreckage like a child in a candy store. On the Imperator Wrath, Kalen watched the slaughter. The mighty battle fleet Obscurus was being dismantled by a single biological entity using one finger. It wasn't a battle, it was inventory management. Disengage, Admiral Voight screamed over the Vox. His composure shattered. All ships, emergency warp jump. Run in the Emperor's name. Run. The remaining ships broke formation, their engines flaring in panic. They tore holes in reality, fleeing into the hell of the warp rather than face the monster in the void. Frieza watched them go. He didn't pursue. He simply hovered amidst the drifting debris of the Imperial Navy, smiling that terrible corporate smile. Zarbon Frieza said into his comms, "Send a message to their command. Tell them I'm open to further negotiations. But the next time they interrupt my schedule, I'll charge a late fee." Kalen stood on the observation deck, his optical sensors recording the impossible. The logic of the machine god had failed. Faith had failed. Firepower had failed. He looked at the small white figure floating in the dark. For the first time in his life, Magos Adept Kalen deleted the prayer subroutines from his mind. They were inefficient. He opened a new file analysis of superior management strategies. The transition of power on Gehenna Prime did not involve parades. It involved spreadsheets. Magos Adept Kalen stood in the corner of what had once been the planetary governor's audience chamber. It was unrecognizable. The Baroque statues of weeping saints were gone. The heavy, incense-stained tapestries depicting the martyrdom of Saint Drusus had been incinerated. The room was now white, violently clinically white. Kalen's mechadendrites twitched, trying to interface with the new dataports Zarbon had installed. The logic spirits of the planetary network were screaming in confusion. They weren't being asked to pray. They were being asked to optimize. Efficiency is up 14%. Kalen vocalized, his voice a quiet rasp of static. The Prometheum refineries have ceased the right of percussive maintenance and simply replaced the broken valves. It was heresy. It was beautiful. In the center of the room, Lord Frieza floated in his hoverpod, reviewing a data slate with the boredom of a god reading a menu. He hadn't killed Governor Hestus. He had demoted him to regional manager. My Lord Zarbon announced from the doorway, his voice dripping with amusement. The audit team has arrived. The Inquisition Frieza corrected without looking up. Let them in. I do enjoy a good performance review. The doors slammed open. They weren't opened by hand. They were flanked by Frieza Force soldiers who looked at the newcomers with the confident sneer of men who were paid in actual currency, not corpse starch. Inquisitor Lord Matthias Covenant strode in. He was a landscape of scars and bad intentions, wearing a rosette that gave him the authority to burn stars. Behind him walked Sister Superior Cassandra of the Bloody Rose, her power armor screeching with servo-motor aggression an interrogator Eisenhorn a psyker whose eyes bled faint smoke. Kalen felt his threat assessor's red line, an Inquisitor Lord. In any other circumstance, Kalen would have been on his knees, begging forgiveness for merely existing. But Frieza didn't look up. "You are late," the alien said, swirling his wine. "I scheduled this meeting for midday. It is now 12:03. Covenant stopped. The silence stretched tight as a piano wire. "I am Inquisitor Lord Covenant of the Ordo Xenos." The human announced, his voice like grinding stones. "I speak with the absolute authority of the God Emperor of mankind. You are a biological aberration. You have trespassed on his domain." Technically, Frieza interrupted, finally deigning to look at them. "I have acquired distressed real estate, and I killed 6 billion people to sign the deed. I believe that constitutes squatters' rights in any court." Sister Cassandra stepped forward, her hand dropping to the heavy bolter at her hip. "You blaspheme Xenos filth. You stand before the Emperor's judgment. Repent, and your death will be swift." Frieza smiled. It wasn't the smile of a warrior. It was the smile of a reptile spotting a wounded mouse. Zarbon Frieza sighed. "Show them the quarterly projections." Zarbon tapped a console. A hololith sprang to life between them. It didn't show war. It showed numbers. Since Lord Frieza's acquisition of Gehenna Prime, Zarbon lectured, sounding like a university professor addressing slow children, planetary output has increased by 40%. Crime is down. Malnutrition is down. The sacrifice of psychics to maintain your astropathic choir has been halted because we simply upgraded the comms array. Kalen watched the Inquisitor's face. It wasn't fear, it was confusion. The Imperium understood hate. It understood war. It did not understand a Xenos who fixed the plumbing. "You offer us efficiency," Covenant spat the word, tasting like bile. "You think you can buy the Imperium with production quotas." "I think the Imperium is bankrupt," Frieza said, floating higher. "I've reviewed your history. You are an empire of 1,000,000 worlds ruled by a corpse on a battery. You fight wars you can't win against enemies you can't understand. You call it faith. I call it bad management." "Enough," Sister Cassandra roared. "Die, heretic." She drew her bolter. The movement was a blur of transhuman speed. The weapon fired a mass-reactive shell designed to blow a tank apart from the inside. The shell stopped. It didn't hit a wall. It didn't hit a shield. It stopped 3 inches from Frieza's nose, held in a grip of psychic telekinesis that felt to Kalen's sensors like the gravity of a collapsing star. Frieza looked at the floating bullet. "Rude," he whispered. He flicked his eyes. Sister Cassandra screamed. It wasn't a long scream. Her power armor imploded. The ceramite crumpled like wet paper folding in on itself, crushing bone and meat into a dense sphere of crimson scrap. Frieza didn't even lift a finger. He just applied pressure with his mind. The sphere of what used to be a Sister of Battle dropped to the floor with a wet thud. Inquisitor Covenant did not flinch. He stared at the alien, his hand hovering over his own weapon. "What are you?" the Inquisitor whispered. Frieza floated down, landing softly on the pristine white floor. He walked toward Covenant, his tail swishing with hypnotic rhythm. "I am a businessman," Frieza said softly, "but currently I am operating at an entry-level position." He stopped inches from the Inquisitor. "This form you see, this is my first form. It is my walking around the office attire. I have 3 more. Each one multiplies my power exponentially." Kalen's logic stack froze, multiplies. The energy output required to destroy the fleet in orbit was already incalculable, if that was a fraction. Here is my counteroffer. Frieza hissed his face close enough that Covenant could smell the ozone and whine. You will leave my sector. You will tell your high lords that Gehenna is under new management. You will stop sending fleets to die because, frankly, cleaning up the debris is cutting into my profit margins. And if we refuse, Covenant asked, his voice steady, though Kalen detected his heart rate spiking to 180 beats per minute. Then I will show you my second form, Frieza promised, and I will depopulate this sector one planet at a time, broadcast it on every frequency, and mail the ashes to Terra. Frieza turned his back on them. The ultimate disrespect. You have 1 month. Run along now. I have a meeting with the Mechanicus. Covenant stared at the alien's back. For a second, Kalen thought the Inquisitor would attack. He saw the calculation in the old man's eyes, the realization that martyrdom here would achieve nothing. We will convey your terms, Covenant said. He looked at the wet sphere of armor on the floor. And we will remember this. I certainly hope so, Frieza called out as they retreated. When the doors closed, Frieza let out a long, bored sigh. Zarbon, have the janitors clean that up. It stains. He looked at the corner. Magos Kalen. Kalen jumped, his servo joints locking. Yes, Lord Frieza. You recorded that? Yes, Lord. High definition ocular feed. Audio fidelity 100%. Good. Upload it to the planetary network. Title it Hostile Takeover, a case study. Frieza floated back to his pod. Now prepare a shuttle. We're going to Metallurgicus Prime. I need guns, and I hear the toaster worshippers there make the best ones. Kalen bowed, the binary chant in his head. The flesh is weak suddenly felt outdated. Flesh was weak, yes, but this flesh was currency. And for the first time in centuries, Kalen wanted to see what it could buy. Forge World Metallurgicus Prime did not breathe. It choked. From the viewport of Frieza's shuttle, Magos Adept Kalen looked down at the planet. It was a ball of iron and smog, wrapped in the suffocating embrace of industry. There were no oceans, only coolant lakes. There were no forests, only forests of smokestacks, belching sacred exhaust into a sky the color of a bruise. Quaint Frieza remarked, sipping his wine as the shuttle descended. It looks like a factory that vomited on a planet. Kalen's logic processors felt a spike of indignation, but it was quickly suppressed by the cold weight of the new data ports Zarbon had installed in his skull. This is a sacred forge world, Lord Frieza. Kalen explained, his voice modulator clicking. It has produced weapons for the Imperium for 6,000 years. The surface is covered in macro cathedrals dedicated to the manufacturing of death. 6,000 years, Frieza mused. And yet, looking at your fleets, you haven't updated the design once. That's not tradition, Magos. That's stagnation. The comms console lit up. It wasn't a hail, it was a screech of binary refusal. Fabricator Locum Ziston 7, the ruler of this world, appeared on the hololith. He was more machine than man, a construct of brass and cables, his few remaining organic parts withered and gray. Xenos entity Ziston 7's voice was a monotone wall of sound. You violate the sanctity of the Omnissiah's domain. The forge belongs to the machine god. We do not negotiate. We do not yield. Activate Defense Protocol Omega-7. Kalen felt the planet below wake up. This wasn't just a military mobilization. It was a planetary immune response. Massive sections of the crust retracted, revealing guns the size of starships. Plasma batteries that drew power from the planet's core began to glow with the fury of trapped suns. Conversion beamers, weapons that turned matter into screams, swiveled toward the tiny shuttle. "They are firing everything," Kalen noted, calculating the energy output. Survival probability 0. Frieza stood up. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed, like a manager whose keycard wasn't working. "Zarbon, hold my wine." Frieza stepped out of the shuttle airlock, floating directly into the path of a planetary defense grid capable of cracking a moon. The sky turned white. Metallurgicus Prime unleashed its fury. Plasma bolts the size of cities streaked upward. Vortex missiles tore holes in reality. It was a barrage that would have annihilated a Tyranid hive fleet. Kalen watched the tactical feed, his optics recording the impossible. Frieza didn't dodge. He didn't put up a shield. He simply flew through it. The plasma washed over his white armor and dissipated like mist. The conversion beam struck his chest and fizzled out, unable to find a frequency that could unravel his biology. "Thermodynamics failure," Kalen whispered. "The laws of physics are filing a complaint." Frieza hovered above the primary defense platform, a fortress monastery, mounting a macro cannon blessed by the fabricator general himself. He looked down at it with mild disdain. "That was a warning shot," Frieza announced, his voice overriding every Vox channel on the planet. He raised a finger. A tiny sphere of purple energy no larger than a marble formed at the tip. He flicked it downward. The sphere touched the fortress. There was no sound at first, just a blinding flash of violet light. Then the seismic sensors screamed. The fortress, along with 40 kilometers of surrounding industrial complex, simply ceased to exist. It wasn't blown up, it was deleted. A perfect, smooth crater remained glowing with residual energy. "I can continue removing your assets, one by one." Frieza's voice boomed. "Or you can acknowledge reality and check your email. I've sent a proposal." Down in the Forge Temple fabricator, Locum Ziston 7 ran the calculations. Continue resistance, 97.3% chance of total facility loss. Surrender, 82.1% chance of operational continuity. The logic of the machine god was absolute. Survival was efficient. Death was waste. "Ceasefire," the fabricator transmitted. "Request terms." 15 minutes later, Frieza stood in the heart of the primary Forge Temple. The air smelled of ozone and sacred oil. Thousands of tech priests, their red robes rustling like dry leaves gathered in the shadows, their optics whirring as they scanned the alien who had just tanked a planetary defense grid with his face. Frieza walked through the Cathedral of Gears, flanked by Zarbon and Kalen. He looked at the massive assembly lines producing Lehman Russ battle tanks. "Inefficient," Frieza commented, tapping a tank hull. "Too much heavy metal, not enough energy shielding. And why are you singing to the engine?" "It is the rite of ignition," a tech priest muttered, "to appease the machine's spirit." "It's an internal combustion engine," Frieza retorted. "It doesn't have feelings. It has spark plugs." He reached the central dais where Ziston 7 waited. Fabricator Frieza smiled. "Thank you for being reasonable. I dislike destroying functional infrastructure. It cuts into the profit margins." "State your terms," Ziston 7 droned. "Simple," Frieza said. "You continue operations. Your rituals, your prayers, your little incense burners, keep them. I don't care, but 70% of your output now belongs to me." 70% is unsustainable, Ziston 7 countered. The Mechanicus Frieza interrupted. Just watched me delete their best gun with a flick of my wrist. You are not negotiating from a position of strength. He signaled Zarbon. The handsome alien stepped forward and placed a data core on the altar. It hummed with a blue light that was distinctly not Imperial. However, Frieza purred, I am a benevolent employer. 65%. And in exchange, I give you this. Ziston 7's mechadendrites extended, hovering over the device. What is this? Schematics, Frieza said. From my universe. Energy weapons that don't overheat every 5 minutes. Armor composites that are lighter than plasteel and stronger than adamantium. Manufacturing processes that will increase your output by 40% without you needing to pray to a toaster. A ripple of shock went through the assembled priesthood. Tech heresy. To innovate was a sin. To accept alien tech was an abomination. But Ziston 7 was looking at the data. Kalen could see the fabricator's logic stack churning. The efficiency ratings, they were beautiful. They were mathematically perfect. This is technology from outside the Omnissiah's domain, Ziston 7 whispered. It's progress, Frieza corrected. And deep down beneath all that religious programming, you aren't priests, you're scientists. You want to know how things work. You want to make them better. He leaned in close. I'm giving you permission to invent again. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. Kalen felt his own heart racing. Permission to invent. It was the ultimate blasphemy and the ultimate temptation. Ziston 7 looked at the data core. Then he looked at Frieza. We accept your terms, the fabricator announced. Provisionally, pending verification of efficiency. Excellent, Frieza clapped his hands. Zarbon mark Metallurgicus Prime as our new R&D department. I want prototypes for a Frieza pattern bolter on my desk by Monday. As the tech priests swarmed the data core like starving men finding a banquet, Kalen stood by his new master. The dogma of 10,000 years hadn't been defeated by war. It had been bought out. But the universe Frieza would soon learn had more than one kind of stagnation. The sensors on Frieza's flagship Eternal Supremacy chimed. It wasn't a mechanical alarm, it was a sound like tearing meat. My lord, Dodoria's voice came over the comms, thick with unease. We have new contacts, warp signatures, they aren't Imperial. Frieza tapped his scouter. Show me. A hololith flickered to life. It showed ships that looked like they had been grown in a nightmare. Twisted metal fused with screaming flesh spikes, adorned with flayed skins broadcasting a signal that sounded like a million voices weeping in unison. The Red Corsairs had come calling. Unknown vessel classification, Zarbon reported. They are hailing us. The image shifted. A figure appeared. He was a giant half-machine, half-monster, his armor, a patchwork of trophies taken from dead loyalists. One eye was organic and mad. The other was a red bionic lens. Huron Blackheart, the Tyrant of Badab. Lord Frieza Huron's voice grated, distorted by the warp. The ruinous powers have whispered your name, a being of such ambition, such cruelty. We recognize our own. Frieza looked at the holographic monster. He looked at the spikes, the skulls, the sheer lack of aesthetic sense. Oh dear, Frieza muttered to Kalen, and I thought the toaster people were dress code disasters. Who is this ugly gentleman? Chaos, Kalen whispered, the old fear gripping his organic bits. The archenemy. "Join us," Huron roared, extending a power claw. "Pledge yourself to the Chaos Gods. Gain power beyond your imagination. The gods reward the strong." Frieza swirled his wine, looking at the avatar of hell itself. Then he started to laugh. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just been offered a job flipping burgers when he already owned the restaurant chain. "Join you." Frieza wiped a tear from his eye. "Oh, that's absolutely precious." He stood up, his tail flicking with amusement. "You want me to work for your gods? I'm afraid you're confused, Mr. Blackheart. In my line of work, gods are just another resource to be taxed." Frieza smiled, and the temperature in the Forge Temple dropped to absolute zero. "Now get off my lawn before I decide to evict you." The offer hung in the air of the Forge Temple, smelling of brimstone and bad decisions. Huron Blackheart, the Tyrant of Badab, sneered from the hololith. He expected fear. He expected temptation. In the 41st millennium, power always came with a price tag attached to a soul. "You don't understand what you're refusing." Huron snarled, his bionic eye whirring. "The Chaos Gods are eternal. They offer gifts. They offer a leash," Frieza interrupted, tapping the glass of his wine. "And I don't wear accessories that clash with my skin tone." Frieza floated closer to the image, his face hardening into something that made the tech priests recoil. "Let me be clear, Mr. Blackheart. I don't serve, I don't kneel, and I certainly don't share profits with gods who can't even be bothered to manifest in the physical plane to sign the contract." "Then you will be destroyed," Huron roared. "The Red Corsairs will strip the flesh from your bones." "Get out of my sector," Frieza said, his voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated the temple's foundations, "before I decide to audit your assets." Aggressively. The transmission cut. Magos Adept Kalen stood frozen. His logic processors were screaming, "Threat extremis." The Red Corsairs were not rational actors. They were madmen backed by the powers of hell. "They will attack." Kalen vocalized his fear, overriding his new programming. "Lord Frieza, their weapons are corrupt. They do not just burn matter, they burn reality. We must activate the Geller fields. We must pray." Frieza finished his wine and set the glass on a stack of sacred schematics. "No, Magos," Frieza said, floating toward the temple's blast doors. "You don't need to pray. You have me." High above Metallurgicus Prime, the void tore open. The Red Corsair fleet didn't maneuver like a navy. It swarmed like a pack of wolves. Dirty spiked vessels vomited from the warp rift, their hulls pulsating with biological corruption. They opened fire immediately. Warp cannons unleashed distinct screaming projectiles, raw madness given form. Lances of balefire streaked toward the planet. Kalen watched the tactical feed from the Forge Temple's command spire. Impact in 10 seconds. Shield failure imminent. Corruption inevitable. Then a small white dot left the planet's atmosphere. Frieza didn't take a ship. He didn't wear a void suit. He simply flew upward, breaking the sound barrier, then the escape velocity barrier, then the sanity barrier. He stopped in the upper ionosphere, directly in the path of the bombardment. Incoming warp munitions. Kalen logged, his optical sensors trembling. Target Lord Frieza. The barrage struck. It wasn't just energy. It was hate. The weapons of chaos were designed to twist the soul, to mutate the flesh, to whisper despair into the mind of the target. The fire washed over Frieza and did nothing. To Frieza, the warp wasn't a metaphysical dimension of horror. It was just spicy energy. He didn't have faith to corrupt. He didn't have doubts to exploit. He had an ego so dense it possessed its own event horizon. The corruption slid off his psychic aura like water off oil. Frieza dusted off his shoulder. "Disgusting," he muttered, his voice broadcasting to both the planet below and the fleet above. "You fight like children throw in mud." He accelerated. In the command bridge of the Blood Tide, Eternal Huron Blackheart watched the alien approach. His Auspex arrays were glitching. He is ignoring the warp fire," a mutated crewman screamed. "His soul, it's too bright. It burns the demons." Frieza stopped directly in front of the flagship's prow. He was a speck of white against the rusted iron of the Chaos vessel. He raised both hands. "I'm going to teach you a lesson in management," Frieza announced. "Lesson 1. Hostile takeovers require actual capital." Between his palms, a sphere of energy formed. It wasn't the casual purple marble he had used on the city. This was a dark, roiling sphere of black and violet crackling with red lightning. It grew instantly 10 meters, 50 meters, 100 meters wide. It looked like a miniature black hole that had learned to hate. The gravity of the sphere began to pull the Blood Tide Eternal forward. The ship's hull groaned. "This is your only warning," Frieza said, his voice echoing inside the skulls of every traitor marine on the ship. "Leave. Now." Huron Blackheart had fought the Imperium for centuries. He had stared into the eye of terror. But looking at that sphere of absolute destruction, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a mortal man. He felt small. This wasn't the favor of the gods. This was raw, unaligned, godless power. "Withdraw," Huron screamed, his bravado shattering. "Emergency warp jump. Get us out of here." The Red Corsair fleet panicked. Ships collided in their haste to turn. Warp drives flared, tearing reality open in a desperate bid to escape the tiny tyrant in the void. Frieza held the death ball for a moment longer, letting them taste the terror. Then, with a disappointed sigh, he dissipated the energy. "Cowards," he sneered. "I barely even flexed." Back on the surface, the Forge Temple was silent. The tech priests stared at the screens. The Chaos Fleet, the great terror of the long night, had run away. They hadn't been driven off by a crusade. They hadn't been banished by a saint. They had fled from a businessman who threatened to hurt their bottom line. Frieza descended, landing on the balcony overlooking the assembly lines. He looked pristine. Not a speck of soot on his white armor. Zarbon Frieza called out, walking past the stunned priesthood. "Make a note. Chaos forces are to be treated as hostile scavengers. If they enter my territory again, eliminate them without negotiation. I don't have time for their drama." Kalen stepped forward. His internal cooling fans were spinning at maximum to prevent his organic brain from overheating. "Lord Frieza," Kalen rasped, You denied the archenemy. You stood against the warp, and it did not touch you." "Of course it didn't," Frieza scoffed. "Corruption requires consent, Magos, and I never consent to being anything less than myself." He stopped and looked at the Magos. "Now, about those production quotas. The disruption caused by that little raid has cost us 40 minutes of output. I expect you to make it up by working through the rite of recharge." Kalen looked at the alien. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had taught that the only defense against chaos was faith, hatred, and ignorance. To know the enemy was to be corrupted by it. But Frieza had known them, mocked them, and dismissed them. Kalen felt a logic gate in his mind snap open. The irreversible step had been taken. He wasn't just working for a Xenos warlord to survive anymore. He was working for him because Frieza was better at this than the Emperor. Yes, Lord Frieza Kalen said the binary code for loyalty, rewriting itself in his cortex. We will increase efficiency immediately. Frieza smiled. Excellent. Now prepare a transmission. I believe it's time we expanded our recruitment drive. If the Imperium can't protect its people from the boogeyman, I suppose I'll have to offer them a better security package. As Frieza walked away, calculating the tax revenue of a secure sector, Kalen returned to his console. He deleted the file labeled Prayer for Protection. He opened a new file asset Security Protocols. The Forge world hummed. It was no longer singing hymns. It was humming the quiet, terrifying music of progress. Magos Adept Kalen was archiving heresy. He stood in the data loom of Metallurgicus Prime, his mechadendrites plugged into a captured data core. A week ago, this act would have seen him lobotomized into a servitor. Now it was Tuesday's assignment. He was analyzing the schematics Frieza had provided. Energy shielding matrices, compact fusion reactors. It was elegant code. It didn't scream or demand blood sacrifice. It simply functioned. Kalen felt a cold digital thrill running through his neural shunts. The machine god's dogma was, the flesh is weak. Frieza's dogma was, incompetence is expensive. Kalen found himself preferring the latter. Magos Zarban's voice chimed over the internal vox, smooth as silk over a razor. Lord Frieza requires the production projections for the new defensive grid. We have a quarterly review in 10 minutes. Compliance, Kalen vocalized. Output is up 12%. We have integrated the Frieza Force energy capacitors into the planetary void shields. Theoretical durability has increased by 400%. Excellent. Lord Frieza hates disappointing numbers. Kalen retracted his dendrites. He walked through the forge past rows of tech priests who were no longer chanting. They were working. The sacred incense had been replaced by high-efficiency air filters. The candles were gone, replaced by stark, shadowless LED strips. It was efficient, it was productive, it was soulless. And Kalen didn't care, because for the first time in 6,000 years, the Forge world wasn't dying. Then the planet screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a seismic shudder that vibrated through the adamantium bedrock of the world. The deep-range augurs, the ones that listened to the darkness between stars, spiked with a reading that made Kalen's logic stack freeze. Anomaly, Kalen whispered. Sector Sigma 9. Sigma 9 was a tomb world. A dead rock marked with the triple skull warning of the Mechanicus: do not approach, do not scan, do not wake. Energy signature detected. The cogitator banks blared. It is not warp energy. It is not biological. It is mathematical. Frieza was already on the command bridge of the Eternal Supremacy, looking at the tactical display with the expression of a man whose lunch order had been messed up. Zarban, Frieza said, pointing at the screen. What are those? Unknown. My Lord Zarban replied, his scouter monocular flashing rapidly. They emerged from the dead planet. Ships, if you can call them that. They read as solid geometric shapes. Pyramids, crescents. Pyramids. Frieza sighed. How tacky. I assume they aren't tourists. They are hailing us, Lord Frieza Kalen reported from his station on the bridge, having been drafted as the local expert on galactic horrors. But the language, it is ancient, pre-imperial. It is Necron. Necron Frieza rolled the word around his tongue. Sounds dusty. Put them through. The main screen flickered. There was no static. The image was perfectly clear, rendered with a resolution that shamed Imperial tech. A face appeared. It was a skull of living metal burning with green fire in its empty sockets. It wore a headdress of gold and obsidian, marking it as royalty of a dynasty that had ruled the galaxy while humanity was still banging rocks together. Unknown biological entity, the Necron spoke. The voice wasn't audio. It was a carrier wave that hacked directly into the ship's comms. You occupy territory of the Sodic dynasty. Your presence is an error. Directive evacuate or be reduced to atoms. Frieza smiled. It was his best customer service smile. Greetings, Frieza said pleasantly. I am Lord Frieza. I've recently acquired this real estate. I have the deed right here. He tapped his data slate. If you have a prior claim, I'm afraid you'll have to file a dispute with my legal department. His name is Dodoria. He's the large pink one who enjoys violence. The Necron stared. Humor is inefficient. Compliance is mandatory. You have 10 seconds to comply. Oh, I don't do compliance, Frieza said, his eyes narrowing. I do hostile takeovers. The Necron transmission cut. My Lord Zarbon warned. Tactical Auspex shows 20 capital ships launching. Their energy readings are disturbing. They exceed Imperial Lance batteries by a factor of 10. Prepare the fleet, Frieza ordered, standing up. Let's see if these antique toasters can fight. The battle above Metallurgicus Prime was not a battle. It was a physics equation being solved violently. The Necron fleet moved with zero inertia. They didn't bank or turn. They simply changed vector instantly. They fired Gauss flares beams of green energy that didn't burn armor but stripped it away, layer by molecular layer. Kalen watched in horror as a Frieza Force cruiser, the Profit Margin, was hit. It didn't explode. It dissolved. The hull peeled away like skin, exposing the crew to the void, who were then atomized into green mist. They are deconstructing us, Kalen realized. They are mining us for atoms. Frieza floated out of the airlock. All right, he muttered to himself, let's tidy this up. He pointed a finger. A death beam lanced out, striking the lead Necron Cairn-class tomb ship. The beam punched a clean hole through the living metal. Direct hit, Zarbon cheered over the comms. Wait, Kalen interrupted. Look at the thermal scans. The hole in the Necron ship was moving. The metal flowed like liquid mercury, knitting itself back together. In seconds, the damage was gone. Regeneration Frieza noted, frowning. How annoying. He fired again. A barrage of energy blasts. He blew the ship into 3 pieces. The pieces stopped drifting. They extended tendrils of green lightning, pulled themselves back together, and fused. The ship turned its weapons on Frieza. Okay, Frieza said. That's actually cheating. A doomsday cannon fired. The beam was the size of a skyscraper. It hit Frieza dead on. On the bridge, the sensors went blind. Lord Frieza Zarbon shouted. The green light faded. Frieza was still there, but his armor was scorched. He brushed a speck of soot from his shoulder. He looked irritated. You ruined my finish, he hissed. He looked at the Necron fleet. 20 ships, all regenerating, all calculating. They weren't afraid. They couldn't feel fear. They were machines of absolute determinism. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Frieza realized that business as usual wouldn't work. You couldn't intimidate a calculator. You couldn't negotiate with a spreadsheet. You had to break it. Magos Kalen Frieza's voice came over the comms, cold and flat. Record this. I want the galaxy to see what happens when I stop being polite." Frieza clenched his fists. The white armor on his back cracked. Kalen zoomed the optics. Biological metamorphosis detected. Power levels rising exponentially. Frieza hunched over. His body expanded, his height doubled, his horns grew curving upward like a crown of bone. His muscle mass exploded, shredding the containment suit of his first form. He stood up. He was now over 2 meters tall, a giant of muscle and malice. Frieza's second form. Now Frieza boomed, his voice deeper, resonating in the chests of everyone on the bridge. "Let's try this again." He didn't fire a beam. He flew. He hit the Necron flagship like a kinetic strike from orbit. He didn't punch a hole. He shattered the vessel's structural integrity field. He grabbed the prow of the ship and heaved. The massive pyramid spun, crashing into the ship beside it. Frieza flew into the wreckage. He grabbed a Necron warrior, a thing of living metal, and crushed it in his hand. It tried to regenerate. Frieza applied more pressure. He squeezed until the atoms fused. Crunch! The regeneration failed. I see Frieza laughed a sound like tectonic plates grinding. "You can heal damage, but you can't heal total annihilation." He opened his mouth. A wave of explosive energy roared out, engulfing 3 Necron cruisers. He didn't stop firing until there was nothing left but subatomic particles. The remaining Necron ships paused. Their logic engines processed the new variable. Threat level escalated, probability of victory decreasing, directive tactical withdrawal. The Necron fleet vanished. They didn't warp. They phased out of reality, slipping into a dimension between dimensions. Frieza floated in the void, surrounded by green dust. He reverted to his first form, shrinking back down to his polite, manageable size. He returned to the bridge. Zarbon, Frieza said, settling into his pod. "That was tedious." "You defeated them," my Lord Zarbon said, bowing low. "I swatted a fly," Frieza corrected. "But flies come back, and they bring friends." He turned his chair to face Kalen. The Magos was trembling. "Magos," Frieza said, "did you see that wreckage?" "Yes, Lord. That metal. It heals itself. It reconstructs." Frieza's eyes gleamed with greed. "I want it." Kalen froze. "Lord, salvage the debris," Frieza ordered. "I want that living metal studied. I want it reverse engineered. I want my ships to heal themselves. I want my armor to knit back together." "But," Lord Frieza, Kalen stammered the dogma of the Mechanicus screaming in his mind. "That is Xenotech. It is the work of the soulless ancient enemy to integrate it. It is the darkest heresy. It is a corruption of the machine spirit." Frieza leaned forward. "Magos," he said softly, "look at me." Kalen looked. He saw the being who had dismissed chaos, negotiated with the Inquisition, and crushed the Necrons with his bare hands. "The machine god isn't here," Frieza whispered. "I am, and I am offering you the chance to build things that will actually last. Do you want to pray to a broken cog for another 1,000 years, or do you want to solve the equation?" Kalen looked at the tactical display. The Necron debris drifted in the void. Living metal, immortal technology, the secret to perfection. The irreversible step wasn't a stumble, it was a choice. Magos Adept Kalen reached out and touched the console. He overrode the purity protocols. He disabled the xenophobia subroutines. "I will initiate salvage operations," Kalen said, his voice changing. It sounded less like a prayer and more like a command. "The Necron technology will be assimilated for the glory of the Frieza Force." Frieza smiled. Good boy. Now get to work. I have a feeling the owners of those pyramids will be back with their manager. In the dark beneath the crust of the galaxy, the silent king stirred. But on Metallurgicus Prime, the factories began to churn out something new, something hybrid, something that would make the Inquisition scream and the tech priests weep. Business was booming. The air on Metallurgicus Prime did not smell of ozone anymore. It smelled of roses and old blood. Magos Adept Kalen stood on the primary landing spire, his sensors detecting a spike in the warp that defied all logic. It wasn't the jagged, screaming static of chaos. It was a hum, a singular golden note that vibrated in the teeth of every living being in the sector. Atmospheric ionization at 400%. Kalen reported, his voice devoid of the mechanical calm he usually possessed. Psychic pressure increasing. It is him. Frieza stood at the edge of the platform looking up at the sky. The clouds of smog were burning away, replaced by a blinding auroral light. Him, Frieza asked, swirling his wine glass, though he didn't drink. You mean the battery on the chair? Do not blaspheme, Kalen whispered, an old reflex dying hard. The Astronomicon is focusing. The God Emperor is looking at you. In the void above, reality buckled. It wasn't a fleet. The Imperium had stopped sending ships. They had sent a choir. 50 of the most powerful sanctioned psychers in the segmentum, linked in a psychic gestalt aboard a specialized black ship, began to scream in unison. Their minds served as a lens. 100 Grey Knights, the demon slayers of Titan, stood in geometric formation, channeling their incorruptible wills. They weren't attacking with guns. They were attacking with a concept. A face formed in the golden clouds. It was vast, skeletal, and majestic. It was the face of a being who had shepherded humanity for 10,000 years through the sheer force of his refusal to die. Frieza. The voice didn't move air. It moved souls. Kalen fell to his knees, his logic stack crashing. This was the Omnissiah's avatar. This was the master of mankind. Frieza didn't kneel. He floated up, crossing his arms. You're loud, Frieza commented, for a corpse. You are an aberration, the Emperor spoke. You reject the truths of this universe. You reject chaos. You reject submission. Why have you come to my galaxy? Your galaxy, Frieza laughed, and the sound cut through the psychic pressure like a razor. I wasn't aware you held the deed. From what I can see, you're a landlord who let the property value tank while you took a 10-millennium nap. The golden light intensified. It became a physical weight. The metal of the spire groaned. Kalen felt his organic components beginning to cook. Keneal. The command was absolute. It was a psychic hammer blow designed to shatter the will of gods. Frieza's head snapped back. His wine glass shattered. For a moment he dipped in the air, forced down by the crushing weight of 1 billion worshipping souls pressing against his mind. Then Frieza grinned. Make me. He clenched his fists. The white armor of his first form shattered. The hulking muscle of his second form ripped away. Frieza didn't just transform, he ascended. A column of light erupted from the spire, pushing back the Emperor's gold with a blinding, violent white. When it faded, Frieza was small again, sleek, smooth, but the air around him crackled with an intensity that made the Grey Knights in orbit bleed from their eyes. Frieza's final form. You possess strength. The Emperor acknowledged the voice, wavering slightly. But strength without purpose is hollow. I have endured agony for 10,000 years to save my species. What have you endured? Frieza flew higher, face to face with the psychic projection. I've endured idiots, Frieza spat. I've endured betrayal. I've endured death and clawed my way back from hell itself. I don't need purpose given by a god. I am the purpose. He raised a hand. And frankly, your sacrifice doesn't impress me. You aren't enduring, old man. You're decomposing. Frieza flared his aura. It turned gold. Not the holy gold of the Emperor, but the gaudy, selfish, magnificent gold of a tyrant who loved himself more than any deity ever could. Golden Frieza. The two energies clashed. The sky over Metallurgicus Prime split in two half-holy light, half-tyrant's aura. Thunder rolled across the planet, shattering windows in every hive city. Kalen looked up, his optical sensors recording the impossible. The Emperor was pushing. Frieza was pushing back. And Frieza was winning. The Emperor's projection began to fray. The strain of projecting this much power across the galaxy was tearing the psychic choir apart. Up in orbit, psychers were bursting into flame. You cannot be corrupted, the Emperor realized, his voice losing its thunder, becoming almost conversational. Chaos has no hold on you. You are sterile. I prefer hygienic, Frieza retorted, powering down slightly, but keeping the gold form active. Now, are we going to keep shouting, or are we going to talk business? Because unlike you, I have a schedule. The golden face dissolved, reforming into a smaller, more human figure of light, floating opposite Frieza. You intend to stay. I've invested heavily in the infrastructure, Frieza said, gesturing to the factories below. I'm not leaving. If I continue this assault, the Emperor mused the logic of the man surfacing through the Godhead, I will lose 50 irreplaceable psychers and 100 Grey Knights, and I will gain nothing but a vacuum that chaos will fill. Pragmatism. Frieza smiled. Finally, I thought you were all incense and screaming. Very well, the Emperor said. I acknowledge your sovereignty over the Gehenna sector. The Imperium will not crusade against you. In exchange, you will defend this sector, not for me, but because it is your asset. A buffer state. Frieza nodded. I keep the Orks and the Necrons off your flank, and you let me run my business without Inquisitors ringing my doorbell. Do not expand beyond these borders without negotiation, the Emperor warned, and do not feed chaos. I starve chaos, Frieza corrected. Desperate people pray to dark gods. My employees are well-fed and terrified of me. They don't have time for heresy. Then we have an accord. The light faded, the heavy presence lifted. The sky turned back to its familiar smoggy gray. Frieza hovered there for a moment, the golden shine fading from his skin as he reverted to his sleek white form. He descended to the platform where Kalen was still kneeling. Frieza looked at the Magos. You can get up now, Kalen. The show is over. Kalen rose, his joints creaking. He looked at the sky, then at the alien. You negotiated with God, Kalen whispered. I negotiated with a competitor, Frieza corrected, walking past him, and I got favorable terms. He tapped his comms. Zarbon, send a message to the fleet. The crusade is cancelled. We have a treaty. And tell the Fabricator General to ramp up production. We're officially open for business. Kalen watched him go. The universe had cracked. The binary absolute of Imperium versus heresy was gone. There was a third option now. Profit. And as Kalen looked at the new Frieza Force schematics downloading to his drive, he realized something terrifying. He preferred the profit. 50 years later, the galaxy did not burn. It balanced. Fabricator General Kalen stood on the observation deck of the Golden Spire on Metallurgicus Prime. He was no longer the hunched, rusty figure of a Magos adept. His chassis was sleek, composed of white ceramite and living metal alloy, humming with a silent, terrifying efficiency. He didn't have incense burners, he had heat sinks that vented pine-scented coolant. He looked out at the orbital lanes. They were choked with traffic. Imperial rogue traders, their ships laden with grain, docked alongside Tau merchant vessels. A sleek Frieza Force cruiser painted in the pristine white and purple livery of the corporation patrolled the perimeter. There were no battles. There were only transactions. Fabricator, a voice chimed directly into Kalen's auditory cortex. It was smooth, polite, and carried the weight of absolute authority. The board meeting is commencing. You are 30 seconds late. I would hate to dock your pay. Compliance, Lord Frieza. Kalen transmitted instantly, teleporting directly to the boardroom using the Necron hybrid transmat grid. The boardroom was the size of a cathedral, but it lacked the gloom. The table was a single slab of blackstone polished to a mirror shine. At the head sat Lord Frieza. He hadn't aged. Time, it seemed, was afraid to touch him. He was in his final form, sleek and small, swirling a glass of wine that cost more than a planetary governor's life. Around the table sat the new masters of the sector. Commander Zarbin sat to Frieza's right, reviewing recruitment metrics. To his left was a Tau water-caste diplomat, looking uncomfortable but eager. Further down was a rogue trader lady, Octavia, who had realized that trading with Frieza was safer than trading with the Inquisition. Report, Frieza said, setting his glass down. Quarterly earnings are up 18%, Zarbin announced. The acquisition of the agri-worlds in the Hydra 4 system has stabilized our food supply. Malnutrition in the underhives has dropped to manageable levels. The population is content. Content workers are productive workers, Frieza nodded, and the buffer zone. The Imperium adheres to the treaty, Lady Octavia spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. The High Lords grate their teeth, but they respect the boundaries. They call this sector the Gilded Cage. They say we have sold our souls for safety. Souls are an intangible asset, Frieza scoffed. I prefer safety. It has a higher ROI. He tapped the table, bringing up a holographic map of the galaxy. Now on to new business. My scouts tell me we have a pest problem approaching from the galactic east. The hololith shifted. A purple bruise appeared on the edge of the map. Billions of biosignatures, a hunger that consumed stars. Hive Fleet Leviathan. The Tau diplomat shuddered. The Tyranids, the Great Devourer. Lord Frieza, we must mobilize. We must build walls. We must... Relax, Frieza interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. You're thinking like prey. He zoomed in on the Tyranid swarm. Look at them. Biological organisms, rapid reproduction, strong genetic adaptation. They aren't an invasion force. Frieza smiled. It was the smile that had conquered 79 civilizations. They are raw materials. Kalen felt his logic processors whirl. The Tyranids were the ultimate horror of the galaxy. They ate metal, they ate flesh, they ate hope. My Lord, Kalen ventured. The Tyranids consume biomass. To engage them is to feed them. Only if you let them eat, Frieza corrected. Dodoria has been working on a new weapon, a localized variant of my death beam technology scaled up to planetary defense grid levels. We don't need to fight them ship to ship. Frieza stood up, walking to the massive viewport. He looked out at the stars, his stars. We simply vaporize the biomass and collect the genetic sludge. I hear Tyranid ichor makes excellent fertilizer for the agri-worlds. Turn the Great Devourer into the Great Compost Heap. The room was silent. It was the silence of people realizing that their boss was insane, but that he was also probably right. Draft a proposal, Frieza ordered. I want the pest control initiative launched by the next fiscal quarter, and send a message to the Imperium. Tell them I'm willing to sell them the surplus fertilizer, at a premium, of course. As the meeting adjourned, Kalen lingered. He watched Frieza staring out into the void. The tyrant looked bored. He had conquered the sector. He had cowed the Emperor. He had turned the nightmare of the 41st millennium into a functioning economy. You seem unsatisfied, Lord Kalen observed. Frieza sighed, his tail swishing. I've conquered this sector, Kalen. It runs like a clock. The threats are managed. The profits are high. He turned his red eyes gleaming with a terrifying ambition. But this galaxy is so large, and I've only just finished the first merger. Frieza looked at the map again, at the Eye of Terror, at the Ork empires, at the distant light of Terra. The Necrons are sleeping. The Chaos Gods are hiding. The Emperor is rotting. Frieza clenched his fist. It's terrible management. I really think I should launch a hostile takeover of the entire board. Kalen bowed low. The binary code in his mind didn't pray for salvation anymore. It calculated the odds of galactic conquest. And for the first time in history, the odds were in favor of the businessman. We will prepare the expansion protocols, Lord Frieza. Good Frieza smiled, turning back to the stars. After all, I have a reputation to maintain. I am the Emperor of the universe. Outside, the factories of Metallurgicus Prime roared. They weren't building cathedrals. They were building the future. It was cold, it was cruel, it was efficient. And in the grim darkness of the far future, it was the only thing that worked.